Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking to you about demystifying compensation and benefits for global remote teams. My name is David Houston. I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Remofirst, and I'm going to have our panel introduce themselves in just a minute. We are excited to be coming to you today as a part of the We Work Remotely 10-year extravaganza. I know that many of you are most likely remote workers, or you are a company with global or remote teams. And so you know what an important topic this is. If you agree that people are every company's greatest asset, then you probably also agree that compensation and benefits are a foundational piece of attracting talent, retaining that talent. You might also agree that getting this piece of your business right, it isn't easy. It isn't easy when you're a fully in-person team, all working out of the same office in the same city. It's even more complex if you layer in the difficulties of managing people across different countries and different time zones. So that complexity is part of what we're going to talk about today. So we have some amazing panelists who are going to help educate us on some of the tips and tricks and strategies that you can employ to build a great compensation and benefits program for your team. So with that, I'm going to turn over to our panelists to introduce themselves. But Luke, maybe I can start with you if you'd like to take a minute to just talk about yourself and your company, and we'll go from there.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. So my name is Luke Mackey. I'm one of the co-founders of Yonder. Yonder is a sort of a next generation platform for companies to really give themselves access to core benefits internationally. So not just locally, which we have a great local experience for companies and employees to get access to things like health insurance, pensions, life insurance. But a big problem we found is really the remote side of things. That's where things get quite difficult for finance and people ops. So our focus is trying to really increase the access, make it possible for you to switch on a pension for your team in Ireland or in Spain or in Portugal, or health insurance or life insurance in any of those markets too. But not only do that, but make it really easy to use, interoperable, and engaging for the employees that or the contractors or the members who are actually using it. So that's us.
Great, thank you. Vaso, how about yourself and Ravio?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Vaso Parisinu. I'm the Chief People Officer here at Ravio. Ravio aims to take the pain out of compensation. So for all the people folks out there or finance leaders, I'm sure you've felt the pain of trying to define a compensation philosophy for your organization, whether they're in one market or several, or remote, hybrid, or a combination of all of those. It's incredibly painful. Ravio solves that problem by providing real-time market insights via an integration. And we offer a bunch of cool other features, most recently salary bands. But yeah, great to be here and looking forward to the panel.
Great to have you. And last but of course not least, Nurasil, CEO at Remofirst. Over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Nurasil Serik. I'm a CEO at Remofirst. We help companies hire people globally without them setting up their own entities. We are the most cost-efficient employer of record on the market. Our essential mission is to democratize access to global talent. And overall, we believe that essentially the world is huge, and then you can hire anywhere in the world without essentially having any problems. But that's us.
Thank you, Nur, and great to have you all here. So as I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking about demystifying compensation and benefits. And I think you've all probably established through your introductions why you're in a unique position to be able to speak to this topic. But I think maybe to start out, it would be helpful to size the problem to some extent for organizations out there. So, from any of your perspective, what are the things that companies are finding are either the most significant pain points, misconceptions, or mistakes that they're making when it comes to compensating their team? I'll sort of toss that out there to the group, whoever would like to start us off, but be curious to see what are you seeing most and what are those common misconceptions and mistakes?
You go first.
Shall I go? I'll take the plunge. Yeah.
Sure.
I think so. One thing that we see a lot at Ravio is folks approaching us with a sort of desperate plea for help because they haven't early enough set their compensation philosophy and a framework that ties to that overall philosophy that enables people leaders, the leadership team, whoever it is, to communicate, what the philosophy is, what the framework looks like, how they've come to that, how they've come to the conclusions of the philosophy. And they're not able to communicate that effectively to their team, which means that over time you see sort of churn, because it's not only that people must be paid fairly, it's also that people must feel and perceive that they are treated fairly, which is an equally important part of the of the equation. Luke, I don't know if that relates to what you were going to say.
Yeah, definitely. I think the part that resonates most is kind of starting too late. And that's something that happens in startups a lot, where you are scrappy and you try to move really, really quickly at the start. And a lot of the foundational things that you don't think are important will then come back to maybe bite you a little bit. You mentioned salary bands. We see that a lot with benefits, where companies will try to set up board structures or enter markets with in different ways, through whatever means, whether that's EO or setting up their own entities or contractors, and completely glaze over the fact that they may have that person in that country incompliantly. They may not be giving them basic benefits that they need to be giving them, whether that be in a country you might have, say, oral and rural pension, and they've not actually even set that up, so now they are in violation of the regulator. We see that a lot. Or if it's something to do with the health top up based on the salary that they're meant to be paid, and that they should be contributing to their health insurance. So it's kind of basic things that are just they're just kind of hygiene that we completely miss, and that really all starts with research. Just having someone in the company who's taking that ownership to understand, okay, well, we're about to hire this person in whatever country. Where we need to stop and make sure that we've got the right structure in place, that we're doing the right things as a company. Well, actually, maybe let's go back a step as well and go, what sort of company do we want to be when it comes to even things like comp and benefits? Do we want to be in like a top kind of quartile company when it comes to the amount of what we're contributing to, or are we at a stage right now where that's not important? Maybe it isn't. Maybe the people you're hiring are kind of the sweat equity guys, and they're at that stage where they're not expecting it, but that's not always going to last. So it's about how you go from that really early kind of cohort of your team to maybe starting to hire people who are more experienced, that are obviously bought into the journey, but there's a period of time when you're in your career where you actually have to, you do need to be compensated correctly, and you expect the right benefits, and making sure that you're set up correctly in the team to do that. So that's a really, really important thing. And so it really kind of comes back to basically laying the foundations early and making sure you have ownership in the company to take on those responsibilities.
Okay. Thank you for that. Nura, I know you're seeing people right at that initial offer phase when people are starting to think about hiring people in another country. Does that resonate with you in terms of what you're seeing? Are there any trends that you've seen in terms of how people are handling that initial offer phase for candidates in a new location?
And that's a great question, and I agree with Luke and Vaso in terms of the foundations. But I think in terms of what we are seeing, and then it was an initial concept when the remote thing happened in 2020. People started hiring globally, and I think that the biggest thing I can mention is that people didn't really know what to pay other people in different countries, because what they know is that, look, I'm a US based company. Am I okay to pay 150K to someone in Bangladesh? Is that an astronomically crazy number, or is it good number? So I think that the biggest thing that came out of that is that people wanted to know two things. Number one, they kind of divide into two groups. I would say one group says you pay everyone equally. It doesn't matter if your salary range for software engineers is 100 to 150,000. It means like whatever you hire, pay them that. The other half said, look, guys, like you cannot just go to any market and then create crazy salaries, because that will ruin the local market. And obviously costs of living in every single country are different. There are also taxes are different. And then most importantly, the benefits are different. Health insurance in some countries is mandatory and statutory. In the other countries, it's an add-on. So altogether, when you create that packaging, you need to think about locally what is fair. And then I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. But what I can tell is that for me personally, philosophically, I feel that paying people locally fair, that would make sense, because that would create a local salaries, and then there is a reason there's a local salary. No one tells you to pay minimum. You can pay a little bit higher, but the way you can treat it is, if you take into the local taxes, salaries, benefits, that should create the actual salary. And then that's where it's important to know what every single person is paid in a particular country, versus trying to create a essentially pricing that is standard for the whole world. I don't think that works.
Yeah, so you guys really nicely pointed out what some of the traps that people jump into, can be. A lot of you touched on, how early companies should start to think about this, but maybe we could dive a little deeper on that and say, from what you see, how early should companies think about that? Obviously, we have, sometimes you might just have a founding team, and they're all sort of bought in from an equity perspective and all that, but then you will start to hire that first set of folks globally. So, I mean, is there too early, or when is too late? I mean, I don't know, Vaso, if you have an opinion on that. I'd just be curious to see from your perspective when people should really start to contemplate this and develop that philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, super happy to share, although my opinion is massively biased due to an incredibly painful experience I had trying to introduce that comp philosophy, the comp framework, and salary bands retrospectively for a group of 2,000 employees with something like 1,000 unique job titles. So that was so very painful that everywhere I've gone since, my answer to that question is as early as possible. Now, look, we don't want to overcomplicate. If it's a founding team with, a couple of early rock stars or pirates that have joined for this crazy journey, you're probably starting to think, let's get product market fit, figure out what on earth we're doing before we think about salary bands. So don't overcomplicate, don't get to 2,000 people. But once you start seeing, a critical mass, I would say, as early as 20, definitely makes sense to, at least at that point, correct any massive inconsistencies or anything that's wild, or you realized, oh, we got it wrong there. Of course, you can only really correct upwards, not downwards. That's obvious, I hope. But yeah, I think starting as early as possible, 2025 or so, I think is sensible. And look, it's not irreversible, right? You need to come up with a comp framework that makes sense for that point in time. Hopefully, it'll help you for the next 6 to 12 months, and you can always iterate on it, change it, evolve it as the company grows. That makes total sense. What doesn't make sense is for it to be, no man's land where nobody knows why we're paid that way, and that breeds a lot of people problems further down the line.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I think from what I see, people sometimes myopically think about cash comp as being the thing they should have a philosophy on, but of course, there's a lot more that goes into compensation than just that cash compensation. So, Luke, I mean, I know it's difficult to say across hundreds of countries that people could be hiring in, but what kinds of benefits do you see companies wanting to put in place, or should they put in place on top of just thinking about the cash comp?
Well, yeah, it really comes down to the type of company you want to be, right? So it's foundationally what type of company you're building, and this is Vasa kind of touched on this around. Do you do this when you've got pirates? But at what point do you kind of grow out of that? Because there's always there is no clear line where we just hire this person now and this person won't expect it. It kind of the culture is kind of set from the founders. The founders, when they're setting up a company, they need to decide, okay, what type of company we're building? How do we want our people to feel? What is the you're kind of setting the tone, right? You're setting the tone for how people feel and what people look at you like when they're reading a job spec and they're kind of understanding from externally what your company feels. And there's a few ways of doing that. You can do the absolute basics and maybe pay like 5% more on top of payroll for things like just even access to a pension or some sort of contribution to health insurance or life insurance if you're a little bit further along. And the two levers we see used most are health and pension. In a lot of countries, some of those things are actually mandatory as well. Then you start to see a bit more on like the average size kind of contribution type, which is maybe 10% of payroll is now is an add-on towards a benefit, which can be contribution to like a 5% match to a pension or access to health insurance. And then you go really competitive and you start to see well and truly above that kind of 10-15% mark of payroll is towards benefits you're adding. You're doing really strong health plans, great contributions to pensions, life insurance, income protection, and they're just the core ones that we deal with. But I think the key thing is just making is setting the tone, like understanding what do you want, what kind of culture do you want to build when it comes to how your employees feel valued. It doesn't matter if they're pirates or not, or if they're seasoned kind of industry veterans that you're hiring and they expect something. It's just having an idea of what stage you are at now and where you want to be. And then there's some other points in there around kind of basically being compliant, which are kind of they're table stakes, and you can't really negotiate around that.
That's true, and we'll come back to that compliance point in just a minute. But some of the way you presented those additional benefits was as a percent of the compensation. Do you think that is a healthy way to think about it, so that it allows you to maybe create a uniform policy across multiple geographies and multiple types of roles? Or
no, but it's a very financial way of looking at it, particularly when you're talking to companies and you're trying to understand, and they're trying to understand, well, what is this impact going to have?
Right.
And you can look at it a few ways. You can look at it saying, okay, well, what do you want to do? Well, look, we want to do the minimum. We just want to be able to make sure our team feel valued, and it might just basically be the basics of access and it's like a slight contribution. And you can go, okay, well, that reality is that you're looking at probably adding this much onto payroll for aggregate. And then the reality is a lot of these people aren't going to actually opt into everything as well. So you're not going to see that full spend. So that's just really just a way of us reasoning with companies. But also, like, if you look at what the impact will have, it will have probably some order of impact on retention. And if you start losing people and training people, the cost that you're going to have to actually rehire people, I'm not saying benefits is always going to be the lever, but it does have that effect. And you can kind of, if you can kind of relate the two and say, well, like, if you just adding 10% onto the payroll and making sure that people feel valued and people feel protected and secure, it means that they're less likely to churn and they move on, which is going to add a lot more costs to you try to recruit that person and onboard that person.
Absolutely, yeah. The finding the new person is a lot more expensive than just keeping the folks that you have. So
100%, yeah.
So Luke already touched on this point about compliance, but maybe you can, that's something obviously is near and dear to your heart, given the employer of record business. So what maybe are some of the risks that people should be aware of when it comes to not having the right benefits in place in some of these jurisdictions, depending on where they're hiring around the world? Maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, I think we can get into it in different angles, but let me start from the basic angle that hiring people globally, it is tough. And then making sure that you can create a proper compliance. Every single country is different. And then a lot of our customers come in and say, hey, I want this amount of holidays, this amount of paid sick leave. And then sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher. But the fact is that every single country is so unique and it has their own sets of rules that you cannot just create a single solution for everything. So you need to look into every single country and then what is the right set of benefits. And then a lot of customers just don't understand that why, for example, the taxes could be quite high in Europe versus in the US. But the simple fact is that I think if you look into broadly the total cost of your employment, when you pay high health insurance in the US, it kind of similar to paying those higher employer taxes in Europe, because they do basically pay those insurances via statutory payments or mandatory payments that are paid in the government. And then so that's where people try and think, oh, okay, how can I cut that? You cannot cut it. I mean, in the US, you can definitely think like how much you want to contribute in terms of percentage wise or dollar wise. But in Europe, it's just fixed. And then I think people just need to really understand like what is the total cost of unemployment. And then that's when it comes to understanding just globally, like sometimes you think you can save up by hiring in a country where salaries are lower, but your total cost could end up being the same. So you need to look into broadly and then understand what are the things you're looking for. But at the end of the day, I think without that, the way I look into the compliance is that making sure that in every single country you just basically go by the laws of every single country and make sure you do the minimum. And then on top of the minimum, you can always think of maximum, whatever you want to add, but the minimum is the basis. And then never try and find a way around it or try and create your own hack. And then just make sure that everything, because it's just the way it is. Like in Portugal and Brazil and some of the countries, people do, and in Italy, people do have like 13-month salary, 14-month salary, which is like crazy if you think about it. But you just need to make sure you just think through every single detail and then comply by local rules, because that's what people expect you to pay. And that's when coming back to compensation, people are used to getting that 13th, that 14th salary, and it's you just need to abide by the rules because you're hiring the person from that country, and then people have been working that for the whole life, and then they need to make sure they kind of you meet their expectations. But yeah, I mean, apart from compliance, it's just making sure that you just understand the rules in every single country. And as I said, because I think it's just closer to me to just people try and find shortcuts of creating a standard. Just not try and create a shortcut, but rather try and understand what is minimum in every single country. I think that's the key.
Yeah, totally. Just to jump in there, like for any people leader who's hearing this or watching, can't second enough. No shortcut is worth risking compliance. Often CEOs or directors of companies will have a criminal liability. It is not worth it. You do not take this risk. It is not a calculated risk. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, and interestingly, I know all of you have touched on the idea of retaining talent. Obviously, we want to attract talent, but there's another angle to what a lot of you have discussed, which is, all, especially startup founders, have to think a lot about runway and efficiency and all of those kinds of things. And I think people maybe overlook how much additional cost you could create for the business by getting this wrong on the front end. So Nur mentioned like the 13th and 14th month salaries, and normally you would negotiate that as a part of the compensation, but if you don't do that, the employee is not going to correct you and say, oh, excuse me, you're going to end up paying me too much, right? They're going to just roll with it, as opposed to if you undercut someone in terms of compensation and benefits, they're definitely going to let you know. And so I think you do have to look out for those things, which kind of brings me to my next question, which is, if you're a startup founder, for example, and we'll shift to talking from the worker's perspective in just a minute, where would you go to get this type of advice? Like, is this something that you would find from other founders in your network? Or, I mean, obviously that's part of why Ravio and Yonder and Remofirst exist, but like, what would you recommend they do? Should they poll their employees? Where would you go to get that information to understand really how to structure this from the front end, or even how to develop a philosophy, to your point, Basso? Luke, do you have an opinion there?
I just think the reality is this didn't exist for founders previously. This is one of the reasons why all three of us on this call are talking about or building these companies, is because there's a huge underserved market of a lot more smaller companies that are hiring remotely and hiring in distributed fashions that were very much left out in the cold to go figure it out by themselves, and that's why they're called nomads, and that's why these people feel like they are doing something that, and that's why there's also a huge community, because it's required. Like bigger companies have access to consultants, bigger companies have access to large corporations that will give them this information. They can pay for this information and they'll do it in certain ways, or they'll set up their benefits or set up their infrastructure, and it costs hundreds of thousands sometimes. But that's not possible for a whole new generation of company and a whole new generation of worker, which is why we have to build these things and why we're trying to actually change the landscape a little bit. So yeah, the reality is this didn't exist for the types of companies we're working in and we're building.
Okay. Well, you're all sitting here in your powerful C-suite with your powerful C-suite titles, but all of you, I'm sure, have been employees at some point or another, and maybe even remote employees. So maybe speaking to folks who are interested in working remotely for companies, or current remote workers of companies, what kinds of recommendations would you make to them of maybe like what questions should they be asking of a potential employer, or what recommendations could they make in order to make sure that they find the right role for them from a benefits and compensation perspective. Luke.
Maybe I can jump in. It kind of just comes back to, it really depends how, there's a ton of dependencies here. It depends on the industry you're in. It depends on the role you're going into and the level of the role you're going into. And it also depends on the stage of the company you're joining. If you're joining a much earlier stage company, it's kind of just understanding what the runway is of that company, I think, is a key one. That's not a silly question to ask when you're joining somewhere, and understanding what the progression looks like. So where am I now, and what does success look like for me in the next kind of year or 2-3 years, and then what's success look like for the company, and if success for the company, what's that dependent on, and if we hit those milestones, what are we expected to receive? Is it equity, or ESOPs, or stock options, or is it benefits? Is it like increased comp? All these types of things that are just good to be transparent about as an employee, because if you're working for a good company and a company that also believes in transparency, they should also be sharing this information with you, because the reality is they've already spoken to other people about this. They're co-founders, they're investors, they should be sharing it with their team members too. So I think they're just a question you should ask, and that also just, that's good that they share that information. It's probably not great if they don't share that information, because it kind of gives you an idea of the type of company you're going into anyway.
Totally. And the other thing that I would add is that, don't be afraid to ask to speak to more members of the team. Like, if the company has a culture that they're proud of, then they'll be delighted to put you in touch with whoever's on the team. Like, they'll consider it a duty both towards you, but also towards the current team members who they want to keep engaged and make sure that they're that they also believe in the potential of the person that they're trying to bring on board. And I guess another tip that I've certainly found to be helpful personally, don't hesitate to reach out to someone on LinkedIn who may have been in the organization previously, or who has just left, or ask the hiring manager, CEO, whoever it is, who's a leaver that I can talk to, because they also have nothing to lose, and you'll probably get if it's positive feedback from a leaver, then that says a lot. And equally, any constructive feedback can be really helpful for you to approach the company again and say, hey, I've heard this in the market. What would you say to that? I think that the response you'll get to that is a really interesting data point for a candidate to take into account in their decision. But overall, the message is, don't be afraid to ask questions. That's your right. You're making a big decision to join another company, and you got to do your due diligence.
Makes sense. Nura, I'm curious to get your perspective on this. I mean, one of the things I know you see a lot is maybe where someone's the first person to be hired in that country, right? This company may have remote work available to their employees. They may have a global mindset, but maybe they're the first person that's been hired in the UK or the US or in India. What kinds of things do you see happening in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because people do start with, okay, we're remote, and then they're like, oh wow, I didn't know we can hire in Bangladesh, for example, or in Nigeria, or in what was it, like Trinidad and Tobago, and different countries like that, where you don't really hear people hiring, and then you kind of, a lot of customers are a little hesitant because they don't really know. I think at the end of the day, the reason people are going remote is because they're looking for the best talent in the world. And then it's not about where they're based. It's not about where they are, but about what they can do. And I think for me, like, we personally, even though we're just a shy of 60 plus, 65 plus people, we have employees in 10 or 12 countries. So that essentially tells us that we're not trying to create, I would say, a specific country where we're hiring, but rather we are looking for the best talent in the world. And then that's where, for me, actually, it doesn't really matter where the person is based. And then it doesn't matter if the first time we're hiring in I don't know, in Cyprus or Tunisia or any other country in the world. What matters is that I looked at the person, I spoke with the person, that person has a relevant experience, and then that person can do the job better than whoever we were speaking to. And then that what counts. And then in terms of essentially some of the tips that I would give, probably try and think about the time zones. So the way we think in terms of our company, we don't really care about the country, but what we care about is the time zone. Like so for us, we try and divide the time zones between our customer needs, between our company needs. So for example, if there's a huge concentration of your tech team in a particular time zone, you're better off hiring people in a similar time zone, 3 hours plus or minus within that time zone. And then the same goes into any other department. But most important, I think the key here is actually taking advantage of this, because essentially it used to be that people work they say they work 20 what maybe 24/5. You can do 24/7 these today, because you can hire people globally, and then someone wakes up, someone goes to sleep, and then your company actually live 24/7. That could be your competitive advantage, where your competitors do not actually support after 5 o'clock in the UK, and you support whatever it is in the world. You support that, because that essentially is, for me, a secret hack of a global team, where you have somewhere in the world. So like there was a saying where sun never sets down in the was a British Empire. So it's similar to you, where you can create a similar kind of a company where this sun never goes down, and then that essentially where for you as a company you can create different little hacks. But most importantly, as I said, like it doesn't really matter what country is, as long as you know the rules of that country, as long as you make it compliant for yourself and for your company. But the rest is just look into the person and try and understand if that person is a fit. There are obviously cultural differences, and then you will get to know that very easily. That's why you have probation periods. Everywhere in the world, you have a probation period of 3 months, more or less, and then try and work by that. But essentially, I don't think there is a tip apart from like it's a global world. Pretty much everyone knows everything, and then everyone is on Instagram and in different social media. So people are similar. We are all the same. It's just doesn't matter where you are. Try and understand the personality, and that should be your biggest tip, essentially.
Yeah, makes sense. You bring up a great point about the time zone, and as Vasa was saying, you want to ask the right questions as a remote worker going to work for a business. I think the approach to time zones is one of those things I would want to ask as a worker, is to say, well, I know that you're in London and I'm in Boston, for example, but this other person's in Ukraine, and like, what are the expectations of when I'm going to be available? And ideally you have companies that are working asynchronously, obviously, but I think the other thing is, in this case, of if you're the first person being hired in whatever the location may be globally, you should advocate for yourself, and you shouldn't feel shy about coming forward and saying, hey, here are some minimum expectations I would have as a worker in this location, and don't assume that just because somebody is a remote company or that they have other global employees that they know what would be expected in your location. I know we hear that all the time at Remofirst, people coming forward and saying, candidate XYZ is asking for this. Is this normal? And they can just do that sense check. But more often than not, companies should, I should say, the workers should advocate for themselves in that regard.
Totally. Just to jump in there, can I just say how helpful it is from a people and talent perspective for a candidate to say, hey, this is what, this is the minimum that I expect in this particular market. And, this particular benefit or whatever it might be is so integral to our day to day. This always, like, food vouchers in France is always the one that comes up, but it's absolutely integral, and no one can do without. It is so helpful for the organization to know what their what is expected from a candidate, and at the very least you'll be able to start a conversation, start sowing the seeds for later, and best case scenario, the hiring manager, CEO, whoever it is, will be like, you know what, thanks for the feedback, sure. But people can't help you if they don't know what to solve for. So don't hesitate to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I might just jump in there as well. I think generally remote workers or people who only really want to work for remote companies, they're far more savvy than they were 3 years ago. 3 years ago, it was a luxury to have that ability, and the reality is it was 3 years ago, and a lot of them have probably moved on. So they've seen what a company looked like, where maybe it was acceptable for the company to be a little bit more scrappy, offer, be a little, not have comp bands, not be offering the best benefits, still getting their heads around being remote. And now they've probably moved on to other companies where the bar is risen and the expectation is higher. So I think it is great to be able to actually have employees you turn around to and go, I need this, I would expect this, and other companies are doing this for remote employees. And this is obviously where companies like Remofirst come in and they kind of set that bar as well, and they kind of have all of that built into the platform too, and make that possible. But yeah, I think just generally, I think the good news is just that we're going to be educated a lot by the people we hire.
Great point. So I want to shift to using compensation and benefits as a real differentiator. I think a lot of what we've talked about is figuring out how to get it right, and put yourself in a position where you're not putting yourself at risk, you're not losing talent as a result of your strategy around this. But like, what are some things that you're seeing companies doing? I mean, it used to be, right, you'd build a beautiful office and you'd have nap pods and all those wonderful things. I think that we're definitely shifting out of that mindset. So what are the things you're seeing people doing today that are the things they're trying to do to stand out from the crowd? I think remote work maybe is one of those things, but what else? I don't know, Vaso, if you guys have some Ravio data to speak to that, but I'd be curious to hear your feedback.
Yeah. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at the range of benefits that are offered across, across our entire portfolio of clients. Now, I would say, number one at the moment is flexibility, and that doesn't mean fully remote work, but the ability to, I don't know, pick up someone's kids from school, or do work from abroad for a while, that kind of thing. So flexibility in different forms is really high up there. And more we're seeing customization of benefits packages. So, there may be different age groups where something like life insurance is not a top priority. You're not really thinking about, family contingency or whatever that might be. So personalizing a benefits package, or at the very least allowing employees to pick and choose from an array of offerings as to what suits their lifetime at that point in time, is becoming more and more common, and something that I certainly advocate for, because everyone's different stages of their lives and has different needs, and I think employers have a duty to accommodate that.
Makes sense. Luke, anything you'd share on that front?
I think just generally, I think a lot of companies have moved away from saying we're remote first. I think the thing is just we're flexible, and flexible means remote can mean remote first. It can mean that you have a hub, or you have access to a desk in an office near you, or an office in a commuter hub, or whatever that is. I think that's just a key one. I think that's just something that has changed a little bit. And then I think there are some pitfalls with coming remote, which is around like losing that, obviously, that more human element or the culture that you're going to build in person. I think it's just like you're seeing a lot more companies really, really advocate for more offsites, whether that be full team offsites, which sometimes can be very, very difficult because your team might be really, really big. Or even just like a kind of micro offsites is something that we're looking at doing, and we're doing at the moment, is where we do 2 offsites a year. One is with the full team. We bring everyone to one place, and one place that we can all be together for a few days. And then what we're looking at doing is things like bringing different teams, like our go-to-market team or our product team or our engineering team together, and means that they're focusing on very obviously focused problems and strategy and building team and culture and trust. But they're doing it we're doing it with the people who they work with on a day-to-day basis. Things like that have really mattered, because we've noticed it ourselves. When we do these, everyone leaves with far more energy, far more motivation, way more ideas. And I think that sometimes you can fall into a bit of a trap of I suppose, just the back and forth on a screen, which just feels a little, sometimes you bring in people that may feel a little bit more transactional, trying to remove that kind of transaction element to what happens when you're building a business. There is a huge amount of culture and personality that needs to be added to who the people who are joining your company. And these are just small things you can do to try and build that a bit more.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think we're even seeing companies being created now that their entire ethos is about bringing teams together, like creating those kind of offsite experiences and all that sort of thing. And I know Nura's, we're drinking our own champagne at Remofirst. I think there's 2 people on my team who are usually in Boston and Mexico City, and they're working from Portugal for the next 10 days. And, so like that flexibility to your points is really important. Okay. So we are coming up towards the end here. I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of share what you would say were maybe your top recommendations, if you have 1 or 2 that you want to leave people with as we exit here around this very complex topic of compensation and benefits, and maybe the things that you would want to leave people with before we wrap up. So I don't know, Nura, if you want to kick us off, then we can go around.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll keep it simple. I'll just provide 3 fundamental things that we use for ourselves. Number 1, don't compromise on compliance. I think that's the key, as Vasa and I discussed. It's just that there are no shortcuts. I mean, we tried, everyone tries. It's just, as Vasa says, it never pays off. It's better just to do it by the book, and then you will thank yourself in a few years later. So never compromise on compliance. Number 2 is be flexible. I think just Luke mentioned a good point. It's no more, I only do remote. I mean, do whatever it works for you. I mean, if you need to have people in the office, rent them, provide them WeWork, provide them co-working. If anyone doesn't want to do it, that's also fine. So I think flexibility is the key. So making sure that you create something, I don't want to call it hybrid because a lot of people call a lot of things hybrid, but I would say just flexibility, where hybrid for me is where you essentially say, hey, once a week you all have to come to the office versus this is not about that. This is more about whatever works for each person. And then if that person needs the space to go and work from WeWork, that's great for them. If the others don't need it, that's also fine. You don't need to have a standard policy for everyone. I think it's just like, it's so hard to create a standard policy that works in 150 plus countries. So you're better off just being flexible and in creating, I know, 3, 4 rules that usually you can and cannot do, rather than trying and creating one thing that works for everyone. And then the last thing, just connected to benefits, I think as we all agreed, is that it is very important to make sure that you do it as early as possible, and then try and create that benchmarks to create that consistency within your team, because sooner or later you will realize that something went wrong, where someone is unhappy just because someone is paid, even doing the same job but paid less. So make sure you definitely look into different services like Bravia, Yonder, and the others to make sure that you can think about compensation, you can think about additional benefits. So creating that whole package and then making sure that it's set in stone, it will make your life a lot more easier. And I think that's the key, is just making sure that you try and do as early as possible. And then that's what I think the 3 things that I would focus for anyone who wants to create a remote work culture within their company.
Thanks, Nur. Luke, how about you?
Yeah, I think we're gonna really end up saying the same things a lot here, because I think we're obviously similar stages, but also we probably see the same problems over and over again. But I think I've mentioned this before, but really it comes down to the people team and the founders really early on to decide what type of company you want to build. Like, do your research on what the market looks like, because when you go and start hiring people, or you start looking at what your competitors are hiring, what's expected in the industry, you do not want to be in a position where you're on the back foot. So decide what that is. I think the founders will always have an idea of that, and sometimes that can be, oh, we want to be scrappy, we want to be different. But when, like, that's really where heads of people and that first type of role comes in and really has to start stamping their ground. That's really important to do, and do that early when that person comes in the door, or as a founding team. And then it's actually kind of eating your own dog food, is actually implementing these things. It's not just talking about them, it's actually putting them in place. So that we see that a lot of people put things off, or people say they're great companies, and it's less about what you say, is what you do. We've seen multiple companies we've hired from companies where they say they're going to do all these different things when they hit these different milestones, and they never do it. And it comes to a point where you're actually just no return, and the priorities shift, and you just become it's a dangerous place where when you've got employees coming to you saying, hey, you're going to do that, you said you're going to do this thing 6 months ago, a year ago, 18 months ago, why it never gets done. And all that people ops can really say then at that point is like, sorry, our goal right now is fundraising. Like it's not so that's just not a good place to be. So I think like make sure you don't get to that point. Make sure you get to a point where you've got these things in places, whether they're levers or whether they're key parts of your culture. And you don't have to kind of backtrack, because it's just such a really not a nice place to be as a company when you're doing the things you can't reverse those decisions. Like these are things that happen early on. So it really just comes back to putting a stamp on where you want to be, doing your research on what the market looks like, and getting things in early before it's too late.
Okay, Vaso, we might give you the last word on this. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, totally. In fact, you've both set me up really well here. So what I was going to end with was, start early. Ravio does a lot of the heavy lifting for you because it is a really painful experience. So thinking about comp frameworks, about salary bands, or about, what do we want our philosophy to be? That's a lot of work. We've automated a bunch of it. We'll guide you through it, but start early. It's really, really important. And then secondly is solve for clarity, right? Like you want your employees to know what is happening, how their comp and how their benefits and any equity packages, how you've come to that conclusion and the why. And it's totally fine for a founder, a leadership team, whoever it is, to put their own stamp on how they think about compensation. But you need to be clear so that message is received by your customers, and in this case, they're your employees. So to summarize, start early and solve for clarity.
Just one more thing on that, because I think one thing we didn't touch enough on is we've spoken about all these different things you can implement, and that's really scary for companies because it's time and it's money. A lot of these things can be done in a very affordable way. Like Ravio, for example, I'm pretty sure you guys have a free tier. Like, so you could really implementing these things really, really early and getting access to this product, to this data really early. Like even with us, our products are contribution based. You could just decide not to contribute a large amount, but give access really early on. And these are things that weren't previously available to companies of our size, or the size of the companies we work with. So I think it's just get past the inertia of the time and the money, because the reality is we're building great user experiences that remove a lot of that.
Yeah. I think said another way, there's just no excuse anymore, right? There's great organizations like Remofirst, like Yonder, and like Ravio making this possible for a lot of different companies. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you so much to the three of you, Maricel, Luke, Vaso. This is excellent. You gave some great advice. I think remote workers, remote employers out there are going to walk away a little smarter about how they can approach compensation and benefits. And we want to thank We Work Remotely for including us in this 10-year program. And otherwise, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.